Sold as a slave, an alien girl finds unexpected hope in a human's kindness. The twin suns of Tazral 7 burned high above the open slave market, casting a brutal, oppressive heat over the crowd of traders, mercenaries, and spectators who buzzed. With anticipation around the central auction stage, a rusted platform of metal and old bone that stood as a grim monument to the galaxy's darkest economy. The smell of sweat, blood, and scorched metal choked the air, but none of it seemed to bother the auctioneer as he raised his booming voice over the din, shouting prices and advertising his wares with theatrical flair. In a reinforced cage, off to the side barely shaded from the suns, Lyra sat on the ground with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, her thin frame shivering despite the heat. Her skin, a pale lilac that shimmered faintly in certain lights, was smeared with dust and bruises from the journey, one that had started in betrayal. She had trusted the merchant who promised her work, a future, something better than the chaos of her war-torn colony. But she'd been sold instead, bartered like livestock to cover his gambling debt, and now she was here, waiting to be bought by whatever twisted soul had the credits and the craving for a sentient girl with trace psychic abilities. Lyra's silver eyes, once bright with curiosity and defiance, now stared blankly past the bars, her hope as hollow as the empty canister of water that lay beside her. She'd heard stories of what happened to aliens like her, used for labor until their bodies broke down, sold again to crueler hands, or worse, kept for the sadistic amusement of rich collectors with a taste for pain and control. She had resigned herself to the inevitability of suffering, rehearsing in her mind how she would endure the pain, how she would fight the urge to scream when they hurt her, how she would retreat into herself until nothing could reach her anymore. When the slaver's guards came and yanked open her cage, she didn't resist. What was the point? She kept her head down as they shoved her onto the platform, chains cold against her wrists and ankles, the crowd roaring with interest as the auctioneer announced her as Lot 492, female humanoid, late teens, high genetic integrity, strong psychic resonance, exotic, obedient, and untouched. Lies. She was neither obedient nor broken, not yet, though she kept her face impassive, knowing that even the smallest twitch of fear could drive up the price. The auctioneer was just finishing his pitch when a man stepped forward from the crowd, and Lyra looked up, just for a second, caught off guard. He was human, older than most of the bidders, maybe in his late 40s or early 50s, with sun-worn skin and gray threaded through his dark hair. He wore plain clothes, a simple utility vest, and worn boots, no flashy armor or insignia, no cruelty in his eyes. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Men like him didn't come to these places, not unless they were hiding something worse. 10,000 credits, he said, his voice calm but firm, carrying over the crowd like a stone dropped into still water. The auctioneer blinked, surprised by the size of the bid. 10,000? From the human in row 6? Do I hear 11? But no one challenged it. Perhaps they assumed he was someone important. Perhaps they simply didn't want to tangle with a man that confident. Sold, the auctioneer barked a moment later, slamming down the gavel. The crowd's attention drifted quickly to the next item up for sale, and Lyra stood there, stunned, as her chains were unlocked and her ownership chip reset. She was pushed down from the stage toward the man who had bought her, and she steeled herself for what came next. A slap, a collar, orders barked in a foreign tongue, but none came. Instead, he knelt slightly, just enough to meet her gaze, and extended a hand. "Come," he said, not unkindly. "Let's get you out of here." Lyra hesitated, staring at his hand like it was a trap. Was this a performance? A trick? But the slavers didn't care what happened to them after purchase. They didn't stage fake kindness, they didn't care about dignity. Slowly, uncertainly, she placed her fingers in his. His grip was steady, warm, no pain, no pressure, just human skin, scarred but gentle. He led her through the crowd without. Leashing her didn't tug or threaten, didn't say a word as they passed through the outskirts of the marketplace and into a quieter district where sleek earth-made transport ships sat like silver beetles in the dust. His vessel was unremarkable, a small civilian-grade shuttle, clean but not luxurious. He opened the hatch and gestured for her to enter first, then followed, sealing the door behind them. As the engines powered up and they lifted into the hazy sky, Lyra sat rigid on the bench near the back, still chained by habit more than force, watching him warily as he moved to the pilot console and set a course out of Tazral 7's orbit. For a while there was only silence, the soft hum of the ship and the distant whir of the navigation system. Then finally, he turned and spoke. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. "My name's Elias. I'm not going to hurt you." Lyra said nothing. She didn't believe him. Not yet. But something in his voice chipped away at the iron wall she'd built inside herself. He handed her a small bottle of water and a protein bar. Real food, not the synthetic junk slavers handed out to keep captives barely alive, and then walked to a side panel, unlocking a small cabinet. From it, he pulled a med kit, a folded blanket, and a change of clothes. "The bathroom's through there," he said, nodding toward a narrow door. "Clean up if you want. Sleep if you can. You're safe now." She didn't move. She couldn't. Her legs trembled under her, not from weakness, but from something dangerously close to hope. She'd imagined so many scenarios in her head, every twisted possibility, every dark fate, but not this. Not a quiet man with soft eyes and calloused hands who offered her food and clean clothes without asking for anything in return. As the stars stretched across the viewport and the shuttle left the poisoned skies of Tazral 7 behind, Lyra finally shifted her weight, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. She didn't speak. Not yet. But for the first time in what felt like years, she closed her eyes without bracing for pain, and as the silence held, warm and unthreatening, she began to wonder, dared to wonder, if this strange middle-aged human who had spent 10,000 credits not to own her, but to save her, might be more than an anomaly in a cruel galaxy. Perhaps he was the beginning of something she hadn't allowed herself to believe in for a long time. A second chance. The hum of the ship became Lyra's lullaby over the next few hours, a steady sound that echoed in her ears as she drifted in and out of half-sleep, her body still trapped between survival instincts and the disorienting stillness of safety. She didn't remember falling asleep, but she awoke wrapped in the same blanket Elias had given her, now tucked more securely around her shoulders, and a faint scent of old fabric softener lingered in the threads, oddly comforting in its familiarity. The human Elias hadn't hovered. He hadn't watched her sleep like a predator or questioned her when she finally emerged from the small onboard lavatory, freshly cleaned, her alien features still drawn but no longer hidden beneath layers of grime. Her delicate fingers trembled as she picked at the protein bar he'd left for her, chewing slowly, suspicious of its taste, even though she hadn't eaten properly in days. He sat across the cabin, scribbling notes into a leather-bound journal. Something analog, strangely old-fashioned in a galaxy of holograms and neural recorders, and he didn't speak unless she did. The silence between them wasn't loaded with tension. It was open space, waiting to be filled at her pace on her terms, and that alone began to chip away at the tightly coiled defenses inside her. After a while, she found herself watching him, with cautious curiosity. The lines at the corners of his eyes suggested he'd smiled a lot once, though that seemed like a long time ago. His hands, strong and weathered, bore tiny nicks and faded scars from tools or lab equipment, not whips or weapons, and his voice, when he finally asked if she was warm enough, held none of the sharpness or control she had learned to fear. It was just gentle. When the ship touched down on a lush, forested moon called Narella, Lyra tensed again, fearing this might be the place where the illusion would finally end, that he would hand her off to someone else, or chain her to a wall. But Elias simply guided her into the small transport shuttle's connecting dock, loaded a single travel bag over his shoulder, and motioned her to follow. His home was nestled on the edge of a quiet village inhabited mostly by humans and a few integrated, alien species. Peaceful ones, mostly artists, botanists, and researchers who had chosen this moon for its mild climate and rich biodiversity. The house was modest, low-built, with a moss-covered roof and wide windows that looked out over a grove of sky trees with petals like sapphire flame. Inside, the air smelled of books, fresh herbs, and old wood. There were no locks on the doors, No restraints on the walls, just a small foyer lined with shoes, a coat rack, and a hand-painted sign that read, "Home is built, not bought." Lyra paused at the threshold, unsure if she was even allowed to enter without being told. Elias turned, reading the hesitation in her eyes, and said simply, "You're welcome here, always. This is your space too, for as long as you need it." He didn't offer her a room. He gave her a choice. She wandered the hall quietly until she found a small guest room filled with sunlight and plants, a narrow bed made neatly, and a soft rug beneath her feet. The first time she touched the clean sheets, she nearly cried. It wasn't luxury. It was dignity. And for someone who had been stripped of that, it felt almost too good to be real. Days passed slowly, and Elias remained consistent, never overbearing, never probing. He cooked simple meals, sometimes humming as he worked, and left a steaming plate outside her door without demanding she eat it in his presence. He spoke to her like a guest, not a burden. When he asked her name, he did so softly, and when she finally whispered Lyra, he smiled with a kind of reverence, as if her name were a fragile star newly discovered. She watched him work in his greenhouse, tending to hybrid plants and documenting their growth patterns, and soon curiosity overcame fear. She asked what one glowing vine was called, and he beamed. "Spiral heart," he said, handing her a small clipping. "Native to Aldry Prime. It blooms when it feels safe." The symbolism wasn't lost on her. She began spending more time outside, her room drawn by the rhythm of daily tasks, watering plants, sorting samples, labeling seed pouches. Elias never ordered her to help, but she found herself wanting to contribute. It felt different from forced labor. Here, her hands moved with purpose, not compulsion. And when she asked questions, he answered patiently, never mocking her gaps in knowledge, never treating her like a lesser being. She learned that Elias had once been a xenobiologist working with the Intergalactic Conservation Bureau, mapping and preserving endangered ecosystems across fringe planets. But after a mission gone wrong, one that cost the lives of several innocent civilians due to a bureaucratic failure, he had resigned, disgusted with the political machinery of his employers. Since then, he had lived quietly, tending to his plants, writing unpublished journals, and occasionally taking in creatures the galaxy had failed. "So I'm a rescue?" Lyra asked one evening, half joking. Elias looked up from his tea. "No, you're a person, and the galaxy should have done better by you. I can't change that, but I can make sure that what happens next is different." His words lingered in her chest long after the conversation ended. She started sleeping with the door open just a crack. Then she started sitting at the kitchen table during breakfast, nibbling toast as Elias read news bulletins aloud in a tone that made even the driest headlines sound like bedtime stories. She began to laugh again, quietly, unexpectedly, at his terrible jokes or when the house AI glitched and sang Earth lullabies in the wrong language. She noticed how he treated everyone in the village with the same gentle dignity. The insectoid courier who couldn't speak standard, the aging blind woman who sold honey from her apiary, the rowdy kids who crashed their bikes near his fence. Lyra wasn't the exception. Kindness wasn't rare for Elias, it was habit. She asked him once bluntly why he didn't keep her locked up just in case. His answer was immediate. "Because freedom isn't something I can give you. It's something you already have, you just forgot it was yours." That night, Lyra cried quietly into her pillow, not from fear, but from the weight of an emotion she hadn't dared feel in years. Safety. Trust. Something close to healing. As the weeks folded into one another, she began reclaiming pieces of herself, singing softly to herself while she worked, sketching alien flora from memory, asking Elias to teach her how to use his microscope. She wasn't just surviving, she was growing. One afternoon, while pruning a particularly stubborn fungal bloom, she looked up and realized she hadn't thought about the slave auction in days. Her past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined every breath. Elias noticed too. He never said it, but she saw it in the way he smiled when she rambled about plant cell structures, or in the quiet pride in his voice when he told others in town. Lyra discovered that one, pointing to a vine she'd nurtured from a dying scrap. Slowly, gently, he began to ask her what she wanted, not what she feared, not what she had endured, but what she dreamed of, what her mind clung to when she let herself hope. And one day, without thinking, she answered, "I want to study. I want to go to a real academy, learn xenobotany, maybe even help rebuild ecosystems like you used to." Elias didn't laugh. He didn't patronize her. He simply nodded and said, "Then we'll make it happen." It was the first time in her life that anyone had said "we" when speaking of her future. It made all the difference. They spent the next weeks gathering documents, applying for grants, navigating the bureaucratic maze of getting a non-citizen survivor of human trafficking into a reputable academic program. It wasn't easy. There were questions, suspicions, endless forms. But Elias stood beside her through every step, not as a savior, as an ally. And though Lyra still struggled with the weight of her past, still woke some nights sweating from dreams of chains and fire, she found herself facing the future not with dread but determination. She wasn't a slave. She wasn't a victim. She was Lyra, student, survivor, scientist in the making. And for the first time, the galaxy felt wide again. Not because it was dangerous, but because it held possibility. And somewhere deep inside, where fear had once ruled, something beautiful had begun to take root. Lyra's life transformed in small, deliberate increments, not through grand gestures or miraculous events, but in the quiet, consistent accumulation of normal days. Days where she was no longer surviving but living, breathing in the present without fear of the past slamming into her like a wave. The application to the Xenobotany Apprentice Fellowship Program at the Intergalactic Research Institute was submitted under a provisional identity provided through a refugee aid alliance that Elias had once helped fund, back when he was still working in the field, before disillusionment took his belief in institutions. Getting Lyra legal recognition had been one of the most frustrating parts of their journey so far, and there were days when she questioned whether she was foolish to dream of studying at all, let alone becoming a scientist like Elias. But each time the doubt crept in, Elias met it with patience, never pushing her forward but always holding the door open if she chose to walk through. While they waited for a response, Lyra buried herself in the work of learning. She devoured Elias's journals, studied the principles of cross-species plant grafting, and learned how to identify dozens of flora native to Narella and beyond. Elias had converted his sunroom into a small lab space just for her, equipping it with microscopes, scanning tools, and an old tablet that stored years of his notes. Sometimes he watched her quietly from the doorway as she worked, the corners of his eyes crinkling with pride, not because she reminded him of himself, but because she was clearly becoming something entirely her own. One morning, as silver mist rolled off the treetops beyond the windows, a secure comlink pinged from the tablet. The message was brief but life-changing. "Congratulations, Lyra Tenvira. You have been accepted into the IRI Xenobotany track under the Emerging Voices Initiative." She read it once, then again, her fingers trembling, lips parting as if to say something, but no words came. Elias saw her from the kitchen, walked in slowly, and when she finally looked up with wide, disbelieving eyes, he didn't ask. He just wrapped his arms around her, warm and strong, grounding her to this moment of joy that didn't feel real until it was shared. "You did it," he murmured. "You really did it." Lyra clung to him tightly, overwhelmed by a storm of emotion. Relief, pride, fear, and something brighter. Hope, not just as a flicker, but a flame. The Institute was located on Junthera 3, a verdant planet 2 systems away, known for its biodiversity and commitment to interspecies collaboration. Travel arrangements were made quickly, funded by the grant and supplemented quietly by Elias, who refused to let her know he'd dipped into his own savings to cover her personal supplies. They spent the next few days preparing, packing clothes, cataloging her notes, building a digital portfolio of the work she'd done since arriving on Narella. And yet, despite the excitement, a heavy silence hung between them the night before her departure. Lyra sat on the back porch, legs curled. Beneath her, watching fireflies drift lazily above the grass, the night air thick with the scent of flowering moonroot. Elias joined her after a while, carrying 2 mugs of warm tea, setting one down beside her. "Are you scared?" he asked, not unkindly. She hesitated before nodding. "Terrified," she whispered. "I keep thinking they'll change their minds, or I'll fail, or they'll see me for what I used to be, not what I'm trying to become." Elias nodded slowly. "Fear doesn't mean you're not ready. It just means what you're doing matters, and you're not who you used to be, Lyra. You're who you decided to become. Don't let the past speak louder than the truth of that." They sat in silence for a long time, sipping tea, the stars above glittering like silent guardians. When she left the next morning, suitcase in hand and badge clipped nervously to her vest, Elias didn't make a speech. He simply hugged her once, tightly, and said, "Go find out what else you can grow." She smiled, trying not to cry, and boarded the shuttle that would take her to a life she'd never dared to believe she could have. The academy was overwhelming at first, a bustling campus built into the living canopy of a massive forest, where classrooms were suspended in crystalline domes, and lecture halls grew organically from bioarchitecture designed to harmonize with the environment. Students of all species moved through the halls, their languages and customs a beautiful cacophony of culture and science. For the first time in her life, Lyra wasn't the only alien. She wasn't even the most unusual. That helped. So did the professors, many of whom had been refugees themselves, survivors of war, displacement, or systemic injustice. They didn't ask about her scars. They looked at her data sheets, her plant graft success rates, her carefully cultivated, bioluminescent hybrids, and said, "Show us how you did this." Still, there were hard days. Days when Lyra's old fears returned, when she flinched at loud voices, avoided tight corridors, or woke sweating from dreams of chains. There were moments when she doubted her right to be there, when she felt like an imposter in a lab coat. But each time she remembered Elias's voice. "You already have your freedom. You just forgot it was yours." And slowly, that belief took root. She found friends, allies, another student named Tyrion, a crystalline-skinned genderless being who loved fungal mapping, and a professor named Dr. Kaur, who saw in Lyra's work not just skill but empathy, a rare and invaluable trait in xenobotany. Her first field assignment took her deep into the floating mangrove belts of Elvira Prime, where she discovered a hybrid pollen species previously thought extinct. Her analysis earned her a publication credit in the Institute's quarterly journal, something that might have been unthinkable just months ago. She sent a copy to Elias with a note. "They used my name, not a number, not a lot tag, my name." He didn't write back often. He never flooded her inbox, never tried to cling. But when he did reply, it was always simple, always sincere. "Proud of you, always." One evening, while tending to a crop of thermal-sensitive rootlings in the lab's greenhouse, Lyra caught her reflection in the glass. Her hair longer now, tied back like Elias used to do with his, her eyes focused, steady, no longer darting like a hunted creature. She barely recognized the girl who had once knelt in the dust of a slave market, braced for agony. That girl was part of her, yes, but no longer the only part. She was something new now, something whole. And yet, life had one more test for her. Near the end of her second semester, the Academy received a visitor from the Galactic Regulatory Council, an inspector investigating rumors of undocumented refugees being funneled into academic programs under assumed identities. The moment Lyra saw him, his long coat, cold eyes, the way he looked at her badge like it was a smudge on clean glass, she felt that old fear rise again, thick and choking. He questioned her, quietly, professionally, but his tone carried an edge. "And your previous designation?" he asked. She froze. I don't have one anymore." "But you did?" "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I was enslaved. I was freed. The inspector leaned back, scanning his pad. We'll be verifying this story, of course, if you've misrepresented yourself. She hasn't, said a voice behind them. Lyra turned to see Dr. Kaur step into the room, back straight, jaw tight. Her records are in order, and even if they weren't, her work stands on its own. This program doesn't judge people by the scars they carry. The inspector left without another word. Lyra stood in the greenhouse long after he'd gone, the silence loud with what might have been. She could have lost it all, but she hadn't. And for the first time she realized she wasn't just being protected anymore. She was being defended, respected, believed. That night she sent Elias a message. They tried to make me feel small again, but I didn't let them. His reply was instant. That's because you're not small, Lyra. You're becoming a force of nature. And he was right. She was growing. Not just in knowledge or skill, but in power. The quiet, unshakable power of someone who has seen the worst of the galaxy and chosen to hope anyway. She wasn't just surviving. She was thriving. And the roots of her new life were deep, unbreakable, reaching for light. The years passed more quickly than Lyra had expected, like pages fluttering in a wind she had once thought she'd never feel again. Life at the Intergalactic Research Institute unfolded in a steady rhythm of lectures, discoveries, research trials, and moments of quiet growth, both scientific and personal. Her name, once a hidden whisper beneath the weight of shame and history, had become a beacon of promise in the xenobotanical community, associated with pioneering work on species regeneration and adaptive plant behavior across volatile environments. But titles and recognition weren't what drove her. It was the deeper transformation, the quiet miracle of reclaiming agency, of walking freely through corridors lined with minds that respected her, of teaching new students and seeing in their eyes the hunger to learn, the same hunger she once wore like armor. Despite the recognition and accolades, Lyra never forgot where her story began. Every success was shadowed gently by the memory of that cold auction block, of chains that once dug into her wrists, and of the broken silence she had lived in until Elias offered her the impossible choice. She spoke of him often, to those who asked about her mentors, always with a reverent smile, describing not just his knowledge but his decency, his refusal to see her as broken. They had kept in touch through messages, occasional vid calls, and the rare shared publication, but as her work grew and field missions took her further into the galaxy, their contact slowed. Still, he remained a quiet lighthouse in her heart. She knew he wouldn't want to be fussed over. He had always valued simplicity, the beauty of a plant grown right, a kindness done without spectacle. And yet, when she received word that Elias had been diagnosed with a neural deterioration disorder, slow-moving, not fatal, but irreversible, it struck her like a thunderclap in the middle of a clear day. The man who had saved her might now forget the very rescue he made possible. She didn't hesitate. Her leave request was approved within hours, and she boarded the next transport to Narella. As the shuttle descended through the familiar green haze of the planet's upper atmosphere, her heart pounded with a strange blend of dread and longing. She hadn't seen Elias in over 3 years. When she finally reached his home, a modest wooden cottage nestled at the edge of a sprawling greenbelt, she paused at the gate, the same gate she had once stood behind as a terrified girl clutching a name she'd only just dared to speak. Now she stepped through it as a woman who had rewritten her fate. The door opened before she could knock. Elias stood there, older, thinner, but still steady. His eyes lit up the moment they met hers. "Lyra," he said, voice soft but unmistakably warm. "You came." She didn't trust her voice, so she just stepped into his arms, holding him tighter than she ever had, grounding him now, as he had once grounded her. The days that followed were quiet, healing in a different way. She cooked while he taught her how to prune new tree hybrids he'd been working on, even as his memory sometimes wavered. He laughed at her terrible jokes, asked her to explain some of her more recent research, and sometimes in the middle of a story paused, unsure of where he had started or why. She never rushed him. She just waited, filling the gaps with patience because that's what he had once done for her. One evening, they sat outside as the sun dipped below the tree line, the sky painted in 1,000 shades of fire. Elias stared at it for a long time, then said, "Do you remember when you first saw this view?" Lyra smiled. "I do. I couldn't believe such a place existed. After what I'd been through, it didn't feel real." He turned to her, something fragile in his gaze. "And now?" She looked at the horizon, then back at him. "Now it feels like the only real thing that's ever lasted." He nodded slowly, his hand reaching out to cover hers. "I knew from the moment you walked in that door, you weren't a victim. You were just waiting for the right ground to root in." Her eyes welled with tears, not of sorrow but of profound, unspeakable gratitude. "You gave me that ground," she whispered. "And you made it worth standing on," he replied. In the weeks that followed, Lyra began organizing his research, digitizing his notes, preserving decades of insight so that the galaxy wouldn't forget what he had given it. As she worked, she began drafting a paper, not just scientific but personal, a dual tribute to xenobotanical resilience and human compassion. She titled it The Kindness Principle, Botanical Lessons in Regrowth and Redemption, and submitted it to the Institute's prestigious annual conference. When it was accepted as the keynote address, she knew exactly what she would do. She would return, not just to honor Elias, but to finally share their story with the world. The auditorium was larger than any place she'd ever spoken in before, filled with academics, journalists, and policy leaders from across the galaxy. She stood at the podium, heart pounding, the lights dimming, a single spotlight casting her in gentle focus. "Years ago," she began, voice calm but unflinching, "I was not a scientist. I was not a student. I was not even considered a person by those who believed they owned me. I was a number, a body, a commodity." The room was silent. But one man, Elias Morin, saw something different. Not just in me, but in every living thing. He believed in regrowth, in soil turned over and repurposed, in things broken and healing stronger. This paper is about xenobotany, yes, but also about the science of hope. The hypothesis that under the right conditions, anything, anyone, can bloom. She delivered the full lecture with poise and purpose, her voice never faltering. And when the final slide faded to black, the room erupted in applause, not just for her work, but for the journey that had brought her there. Later that night, she received a private message from Elias. It was short, shaky in spelling, but unmistakably his. "You made the world see you. I always did. So proud. So damn proud." That was the last message she would ever receive from him. Elias passed peacefully 3 months later, his final days spent watching the greenhouse bloom in colors only he could have coaxed from the soil. Lyra returned once more to Norella, this time not as a girl seeking safety, but as a woman bringing a legacy full circle. She buried his ashes in the roots of a living monument she designed herself, a new species of tree bred from the grafts they'd worked on together, engineered to purify the air and glow faintly at dusk. She called it Marana Vitalis, the tree of enduring light. A small plaque beneath it read, "To the man who taught me that saving one life can save an entire future." After the ceremony, as the sun sank below the trees and fireflies began to stir, Lyra stood alone beside the monument, her fingers tracing the bark that pulsed faintly with life. She closed her eyes, listening, not for words but for presence, for the quiet echo of kindness that had carried her from chains to freedom, from silence to voice, from survival to purpose. And in that stillness she knew, Elias hadn't just saved her, he had planted her. And now, rooted in the truth of who she had become, she would keep growing, stronger, brighter, unstoppable.